Work and Labor Studies, and the Interim Director of the Global Labor Research Center here at York University. While we are not all gathered in the same space, and York University's land acknowledgement might not represent the territory that you are currently on, I would ask us to each take a moment to acknowledge the traditional territories that on which you are on, and the current treaty holders. As a member of the York University community, I recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which our campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaranto has been taken care of by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. This is our first fully remote session as part of our speaker series this term, and we are thrilled to welcome you all joining us from around the world. I would like to note that today's presentation is being recorded so that we can make them available online for those who are unable to join us today, but that the recording will end once we get to the question and discussion period. For those of you joining us for the first time, the Global Labor Research Center brings together academic, labor, and community researchers interested in a labor-centered approach to policy development and social change. In this sense, I'd like to take a moment to encourage those of you new and returning to check out our website, our new video and podcast series, our current projects, upcoming events, and consider getting involved with the center, either as an associate in the form of a contribution to our perspectives or snapshots series, or in whatever ways you are able to. The easiest way to do this is to sign up for our monthly newsletter on our website, where you can stay up to date with all things GLRC related. Switching gears, just last week, a new report by the European Union's space program found it virtually certain that 2024 will be the hottest year on record, and the first to hit 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial temperatures. As UN climate talks falter in Azerbaijan, I'm honored to welcome our three speakers joining us here today to discuss the climate emergency and what to do about it. Seth Klein is a policy researcher and writer based in Vancouver, British Columbia. Seth is the team lead and director of strategy with the Climate Emergency Unit. Prior to that, he served for 22 years as the founding director of the BC office of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, Canada's foremost social justice think tank. He is now a freelance policy consultant, speaker, researcher, and writer. Seth is a regular columnist with Canada's National Observer and adjunct professor with Simon Fraser's University's Urban Studies program, and remains an associate with the CCPA's BC office. We are very happy he's here to join us today to talk about his book, A Good War, Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency, published by ECW Press. Joining Seth is John Clarke, who worked for 28 years as an organizer with the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty, mobilizing poor and homeless people to resist poverty and austerity. Between 2019 and 2022, he was the Packer Visitor in Social Justice here at York University, where he developed and taught courses on the struggles of unions and social movements. John remains active in anti-poverty struggles, including efforts to resist gentrification and fighting for social housing in Toronto's downtown east. He also writes regularly for various publications on a range of issues related to working class resistance and popular struggles, including, if I could shamelessly plug, his excellent chapter in a soon-to-be-released collection from Fernwood Publishing titled Against the People, How Four Nation is Dismantling Ontario. He is also the author of the recently co-authored book with Sarah Glynn titled Climate Change is a Class Issue, which is available for purchase, but also as a free-to-download ebook at climateandclass.net. And last but not least, Rebecca Keetch is an auto worker at the GM assembly plant in Oshawa. She served on her union's local education committee and participated with the union's local political action committee. She is also an activist with Green Jobs Oshawa, a community coalition that came together following the end of vehicle assembly at the Oshawa plant in December 2019, calling for the plant to be converted to produce electric vehicles for other socially beneficial production under public ownership. Each of our three speakers will speak for roughly 20 minutes or so, after which we will open it up for discussion. As I mentioned earlier, during the discussion period, the recording will end. So we are looking forward to your thoughts and questions afterwards. So without further ado, we will turn it over to Seth.
Thanks, Carlo. And good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for all the intros. As you heard, I'm joining you from the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, otherwise known as Vancouver. Really happy to be with you. Happy that you all made time for this topic. Really happy to be doing this with John and Rebecca, who I have followed with admiration both of their work for many years. So glad to be doing this. Um, as you heard, I'm going to be drawing mostly on my book, A Good War, some ideas from the book, Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency, sharing some key lessons from that. And along the way, I also want to share some of the campaigns that we work on with the Climate Emergency Unit, particularly the ones that are most relevant to the topic of just transition and most relevant to those of you who are labor activists. So I'll try to keep my comments, as you heard, to 20 minutes or so, and looking forward to hearing from Rebecca and John and having lots of time for Q&A with all of you. And it's nice, it's a smallish group, so we can keep it casual and have lots of discussion. Just to say off the top, though, about the climate emergency itself and ground it in that. It strikes me that it wasn't that long ago, even at the time that I was writing my book in 2019, that when people, particularly in Canada, used to think about the climate emergency, if we thought about it at all, we tended to view it as a threat somewhere else, sometime in the future. But it sure doesn't feel like that anymore. I think the last few years have really been a time of our reckoning with the climate emergency. Here in the province where I live, British Columbia, we have had, frankly, just a devastating few years. Starting in 2021, where we had this extreme heat dome event that shattered temperature records and robbed us of over 600 of our fellow British Columbians in less than a week. I want to drive home that point. That June 2021 heat dome remains the most deadly weather event in Canadian history. Most of those who perished were isolated, lower income seniors, and it was preventable. If their homes had already been unplugged from gas and converted to electric heat pump systems, which we urgently need to do to lower greenhouse gas emissions from buildings, but which also conveniently cool in the summer, it's very likely that all of those people would still be with us. But we've also experienced, devastating wildfires, atmospheric rivers. I mean, God, we didn't even know what that term meant a few years ago, but with incredible losses, incredible expense to people's homes and infrastructure. As Carlos mentioned off the top, we just keep breaking temperature records globally. Last year was the wildfires in Canada last year didn't just set new records, they exploded them. More land burned in 2023 in Canada than the territory of Greece, and emitted so much carbon dioxide that the emissions from last year's fires were about 3.5 times Canada's total annual domestic emissions from everything else. So this is the space in which we find ourselves, and increasingly the emergency is coming for the people and places that we love, and claiming lives of the very people who are rallying in our defense. Last year also saw 8 firefighters die, including 4 in my province. And what you're going to hear from me is, I'm a little, I've become everyone's weird uncle. I talk a lot about World War II, and I find myself thinking a lot about World War II. And I think about how in World War II, Canada was a population of about 11 million people. Over 1 million of them enlisted. 64% of them under the age of 21. And I find myself thinking, like, who are those young people today? And really, they're these young people like 19-year-old Devin Gale and 25-year-old Zach Muse, these young firefighters who died last year. These young people who are again rallying in our collective defense. This isn't just a Canadian story, of course. It's happening around the world. It's overwhelming at times. It's sometimes easier to look away. I think many of us are wrestling with these growing feelings of grief and anxiety as we witness all of this. And we're stuck where we seem to mobilize to put fires out, but not yet to prevent them. And all of this feels so dissonant, particularly at the political level, where I guess, the opening question I put to people is when you look at federal and provincial government responses, does anything about it look and sound and feel like an emergency response to you? And it sure doesn't look like that to me. Um, and when we think about these events, I guess the point to drive home is that if we fail to act quickly, then over the course of the coming decades, things get very grim. A world that is unlivable and catastrophic for many, deeply uncomfortable and disruptive for all others, quite possibly ungovernable. So this is an ecological crisis, but, and I emphasize this point to you as labor activists and social justice activists, it is just as equally a human and social justice crisis and a civilizational threat. And that's the last of the scary news you're going to hear from me. Instead, I want to offer a bit of a solutions framework, drawing upon my book, which people find, ironically, unusually hopeful, notwithstanding the subject matter. So the original twist of my book, as the title suggests, is that it is entirely structured around lessons from the Second World War. It's great irony to that. I'm the child of Vietnam War resistors. That's why I happen to be Canadian. I cut my political teeth in the peace and disarmament movement in the 1980s. And if you had told any of my high school friends I'd written a war story, they'd be pretty surprised. But here I am, now strongly of the view that climate breakdown requires a new mindset to mobilize all of society and galvanize our politics and fundamentally remake our economy. And also finding inspiration from this story that when we actually treat emergencies as an emergency, they are transformative. They transform our social relations, our labor relations, our economy, our politics. Why do we need a new approach? So first of all, let me screen share an image with you. There. I think you're seeing it. These are Canada's greenhouse gas emissions going back the last 20 years, with a little hat tip to Greta Thunberg and her apt description of climate promises to date as so much blah, blah, blah. And just let this sink in. Like what I see when I look at this, you see some ups and downs. It's basically a flat line. Our GHG emissions plateaued at an historic high. Emissions starting to come down a little bit in the last couple of years there, but fundamentally we have failed to truly bend the curve at the pitch and pace that both science and justice demands. And we are not on a path to stave off a horrific future for our kids and future generations. We have run out the clock with distracting debates about incremental changes. And where it matters most, actual GHG emissions, we've accomplished precious little. And here we are staring down this harrowing gap between what the science says we urgently have to do and what our politics seems willing or able to entertain. And somehow we've got to kickstart something new. And for those of you who work in the labor movement, I think we're at this point where, with the transitions that are inevitably coming, to continue to tie the fate of workers to the fossil fuel industry is to consign them to a tumultuous, disruptive, and hopeless future. But it's also the case that part of what we have failed to do, when I look at the response of the federal and provincial governments, there has been no just transition offer. Part of what has plagued the ill-fated oil and gas emissions cap or anything is that even as the government starts to make moves on climate, they have yet to offer a hopeful and compelling counteroffer to working people and the communities that currently rely on fossil fuels. And in failing to do that, they have made it ripe to present climate policies as somehow elitist and doesn't give a crap about working people. And too much of that critique is true. And it's left us totally vulnerable to this populist right-wing backlash. I didn't actually start off planning to write a war story. My book began as an attempt to look at that. How do we align our politics and economy in Canada with what the science says we urgently need to do? In the original book outline, there was going to be a single chapter on the Second World War because I thought, for all of us who have this question in our mind, like, can we actually retool the whole economy in just a few years? I thought, I'm going to dig into the World War II story because we kind of did that. But then the more I dug into it, it started to explode my mind. Like, I'd been dealing with climate for many years at that point, but it was making me look at it all through a fresh lens. Like, oh, this is what it looks and sounds and feels like to actually be in emergency mode. And I started to see so many parallels between our wartime experience and the crisis we now face, and also this hopeful reminder that we've done this before. We've mobilized in common cause across class and race and gender to confront an existential threat. And in doing so, we actually retooled the entire economy twice. Once to ramp up military production, and again 6 years later to reconvert to a peacetime economy. And so, I remember turning to my wife one night and saying, "Oh, you know what? Actually, I think the whole book's about World War II, and let's explore that." But the question that comes up ever since the book came out 4 years ago, most frequently is, how do you know when a government actually gets the emergency, like when they're actually in emergency mode? And trying to distill the book down to answering that question, came up with this framework that I want to share with you now, of what my team and I call the 6 markers of emergency. So here they are. This is when you know that a government has shifted into emergency mode. And now, appreciate for a moment, these were written with an eye to senior levels of government, but really they apply just as much to a municipal level government, indigenous government, a union, a pension fund, a faith institution, a post-secondary institution. These are the markers of when you know that the leadership is actually in emergency mode. It commits to spend what it takes to win. It commits to create new economic institutions to get the job done. It shifts from voluntary and incentive-based policies to mandatory measures as needed. It commits to tell the truth about the severity of the crisis and communicates a sense of urgency about the measures that are necessary to combat it. It commits just as equally to leave no one behind, understanding that when you're actually trying to mobilize the society, it requires social solidarity. And inequality is toxic to social solidarity. And you need to make that commitment to those who feel economically and in their employment tied to the fossil fuel economy. You need to make a compelling counteroffer, like I mentioned before. And 6, last but not least, you center Indigenous leadership rights and title. And we did the first 5 of these big time in World War II. I would actually say the federal government mostly hit these targets with some misses in the first year of the pandemic. But when it comes to climate, it's not just that the federal government doesn't hit all of these, or any provincial government, or of any political stripe. It's not that they don't hit all of them. It's that they failed to hit a single one of them. So in the time I have left, I just want to explore these markers in a little bit more detail and think about how they also apply to a union and the labor movement. So like when you think about marker number 1, spend what it takes to win, moving into that emergency mentality that frees us from an austerity mindset. We kind of did that in the first year of the pandemic, right? We spent a lot on the CERB and the wage subsidy. So federal government spending, the debt to GDP ratio went from about 30% to 50% in a single year. It's a big jump in a single year. Still pales in comparison to the war. We ended World War II with the debt to GDP ratio more than double that. And in writing the book, I became quite fascinated with this guy, C.D. Howe, who oversaw all of Canada's military production. No lefty. He was on the right wing of Mackenzie King's cabinet. He'd made a lot of money in the private sector before going into politics. But he was kind of seized with this task. And when he was pressed about this extraordinary ramp up in military production and all of the money that was being spent, he famously replied, "If we lose the war, nothing will matter," which I think is sort of apt to the present. And in order to pay for all of that, brought in a host of new progressive taxes, including, by the way, a cap on profits. So the excess, the way the because of the excess profits tax in the war, the kind of profiteering that we witnessed as a country in World War One, and again in the years through the pandemic and since the pandemic, this obscene profiteering we've been witness to, that was illegal in the Second World War. Um, so I think it sort of drives home the need to bring windfall profits tax and wealth taxes to this fight. Again, part of how you commit that when we say we're all in this together, we damn well better mean that we're all in this together. But spending on climate in Canada doesn't hold a candle to any of this. Like, for example, in that first year of the pandemic, federal government spending was about $6 billion a week. Federal spending on climate, generously, is about 15 or 16 billion a year. 15 billion a year versus 5 billion a week. One of them's emergency, the other one isn't. And then marker number 2, and this is the one I want to spend the most time on in the time I have, creating the economic institutions needed to get the job done. During the Second World War, starting from a base of virtually nothing, the Canadian economy and its labor force pumped out a volume of military equipment that is simply mind-blowing. In those 6 years, Canada, with a population about a quarter what it is today, produced 800,000 military vehicles, more than Germany, Italy, and Japan combined. 16,000 military aircraft, ultimately building the 4th largest air force in the world at the time. Here in my province, where we seem to be unable to build a single BC ferry anymore, we produced about 350 ships, again, from a base of virtually nothing. The shipyards had all gone dormant in the Depression. We had to import naval architects from the US and the UK. We had to recruit and train up an entirely new workforce. The Vancouver Shipbuilders Union local went from a small local of 200 guys to the single largest local of men and women in the country. That's what it means to be an emergency. And I see somebody here, a friend from the UAW on the call here. I like to give the example on the automotive front. Think about the timing here. Pearl Harbor happens in December 1941. In February of 1942, 2 months later, the last civilian automobile rolls off the assembly line in Detroit. And for the next 4 years, their production and sale was basically illegal. It's remarkable what can happen in an emergency. And C.D. Howe, C.D. Howe was happy to give private sector contracts to his buddies, but he was in a hurry. And anytime the private sector couldn't quickly do something, he creates another Crown corporation. In those war years, he creates 28 new Crown enterprises to meet the supply and munitions requirements of the war effort. Justin Trudeau has created 2 Crown corporations, near as I can tell, the Canada Infrastructure Bank, which has mostly done very little, and the other one, I hate to tell you, it's the Trans Mountain Pipeline Corporation. It's the one that makes us all the proud owners of a 60-year-old oil pipeline from Alberta through my province. If our government really saw the climate emergency as an emergency, it would, like C.D. Howe did, quickly conduct an inventory of all of our conversion needs and determine how many heat pumps and solar arrays and wind farms and electric buses we're going to need to virtually electrify everything and get off our reliance on fossil fuels. And then we'd see the establishment of a new generation of public corporations to ensure that those items were manufactured and deployed at the requisite scale. And I think labor could be leading the charge on the creation of some of those public enterprises. And your pension funds could be helping to finance them. But we need new municipal renewable energy utilities, or public corporations to mass install electric heat pumps and rooftop solar, and high-speed public rail, and public building retrofit agencies, and public agencies to mass build zero carbon affordable housing. I mean, the possibilities are endless. And I had a little fun with this in the book. I tried to imagine, okay, by the same logic that we created all these Crown enterprises in the war, what would those need to be today? And I have like a 3-page listing of them. But part of why I fixate on the Crowns is because when you're not creating new public enterprises, the best you can do is try to incentivize somebody else to build what needs to be built to do this, meet this task. And that's what the federal government's trying to do, right? They have this whole package of tax credits trying to entice the private sector to build what needs to be built. And it's mostly undersubscribed, those tax credits, because it's those interests that aren't even there. These are inherently public projects that we just need to lean into and do. And then I want to, in respect to that compelling counteroffer to workers, I want to mention two other public institutions, and then I'll leave the other markers be and let our other speakers go. But these are the two institutions I want to tell you about. The first is one that we call the Just Transition Transfer. I'll tell you about the one that doesn't have a lot of traction, and then I'll tell you about the one that does. One of the challenges we face in Canada is that while Canada as a whole is not terribly reliant on fossil fuels, parts of the country are, particularly Alberta, Saskatchewan, Northeast BC, Newfoundland. When I was writing the book, I did this interview with Gil McGowan, the president of the Alberta Federation of Labor. Gil's an interesting guy because he gets climate just as good or better than any labor leader I know. And there he is, president of the Alberta Federation of Labor, no less. But Gil was making the point that the rest of the country needs to appreciate that certain parts of the country have more heavy lifting to do. And he was musing like maybe that should be recognized in the equalization transfers from the Freds or something like that. And I was like, Gil, you don't want to do that because equalization's a mess and mostly works like it's supposed to. And what if instead we envisioned a new federal transfer, purpose-built for this task? We'll call it the Climate Emergency Just Transition Transfer. Make it big, $25 billion a year. But then it would be different from other federal transfers for things like health and education in two important ways. Number one, unlike other transfers that divvy the money up by population, in this case, we would divvy the money up by greenhouse gas emissions. So Alberta is the source of 38% of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions, about 4 times their share of the population. We freeze that in time and we say, Alberta, you're going to get 38% of the money. That's a lot. But the second twist, we wouldn't send the money directly to these provincial governments because too many of them aren't to be trusted, especially that one. Instead, we'd create just transition agencies in every province to receive the money, jointly governed by all levels of government, Indigenous nations, put workers on the board, climate experts on the board, to then deploy that money on climate infrastructure projects and training programs that speak to the reality on the ground of the GHG profile of every province and the labor market and training needs of that place. We've been campaigning on that idea for a while, no take up from the feds, but that would be an example of a compelling counteroffer that would speak to those, I think, who currently feel reliant. The second idea I want to tell you about is the Youth Climate Corps. So I mentioned before how many young people rallied in World War II. And I had this hunch for a while that there were again tens of thousands of young people who wanted to enlist in this task of our lives. But finally, a year ago, I decided to commission a poll from Abacus Data to test that proposition. So in this national online poll, we gave them a short description. Said, what if there was a 2-year program, so not 4 months, 2 years, that said to everyone under the age of 35, if you want to sign up for 2 years, we have a place for you. Nobody will be turned away. And you could work in one of sort of 3 areas. Bucket 1 would be emergency response in the face of fires or floods or heat domes. Bucket 2 would be building community and ecological resilience in the face of climate change. And bucket 3 would be actually driving down our emissions with jobs in building retrofits or renewable energy or public transit and that kind of thing. So particularly around the building trades. And we tested this. And the Abacus results were super strong support across the board, across the country, across every demographic. Even a majority of conservatives thought it was a good idea. Now, then interestingly, and I want to show you this, in the second question, it only went to people under 35. And it asked them, if a program like this existed, how likely would you be to enroll for 2 years? And look at this. I'll show you. Basically, 65% of young people said I would be interested in enrolling. 15% said definitely. Now, there's about 9 million Canadians between 18 and 35. So this is 1.3 million Canadians saying, I get it. I understand it's an emergency. Sign me up. Where the hell is my invitation? Or even look at Alberta. 47% of young people in Alberta said they either definitely or probably would want to enlist in a 2-year program like this. And look at that gender breakdown. I follow the climate polls a lot. This is the only climate poll I've ever seen where the enthusiasm among young men outstrips young women. The very demographic that is most being animated by the populist right now also says, I am highly interested in this. Maybe we should make them an offer to be their better selves. I've gone a little bit over. I haven't gotten to all of the markers. The main thing about marker 3 is we are stuck with governments that are trying to incentivize their way to victory with price signals and carbon taxes and tax credits and rebates. This is no way to fight the battle of our lives. We need governments that are telling the truth. Maybe we'll talk about that in discussion. And that fundamental proposition around leaving no one behind, I've given you examples of how we can make that counter offer. But mostly, there's some climate policy people who say, oh, don't link climate to all these inequality and social justice issues. Like, this is hard enough as it is. They're wrong. We need to link these things not only because they're linked. The richer you are, the higher your emissions. The poorer you are, the more vulnerable you are. We need to link these things because this is how we win. A successful mobilization requires that people make that common cause across class and race and gender, and that people have confidence that sacrifices are being made by the rich and not just the poor and middle classes. And that's what happened in the war, with this famous Marsh Commission, and the introduction of unemployment happens in the war, and the family allowance in the war. Because when you're asking people to join in a grand undertaking, you have to offer an assurance that the society that's going to come out the other end is going to look more just and more fair than the one they're leaving behind. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, Seth. Rebecca?
I just want to say I really agree with Seth's comments about having to link inequality, and I would also add democratizing our workplaces and society more than what it is right now, because we're not going to be able to move forward effectively if we don't do these things. So my name is Rebecca Keetch, and while I'm an auto worker at the GM assembly plant in Oshawa, I'd just like to clarify that I'm not speaking in any way as a representative of General Motors or my union Unifor. I'm only speaking as an activist with Green Jobs Oshawa and as a rank and file auto worker. So what is Green Jobs Oshawa? Green Jobs Oshawa is a coalition of workers, environmentalists, academics, and community members. We came together in response to the announcement by General Motors that they were closing the Oshawa assembly plant. We recognized, in the midst of a climate crisis requiring immediate action and a community facing massive job loss and disruption, the need for a bold idea. We called for public ownership of the GM plant for production of battery electric vehicles or other socially beneficial production that would prioritize social need over corporate greed. A little bit of background. General Motors has been producing vehicles at their Oshawa facility for just over 100 years. It was one of the most decorated, productive, and efficient plants in North America and had produced in excess of 20 million vehicles. In November of 2018, GM announced that the Oshawa facility would be unallocated. On December 18, 2019, the last truck rolled off the line, and thousands in Oshawa and the surrounding community were left unemployed. When GM announced the closure of the Oshawa facility, there was anger and outrage from the community and across Canada, but almost no political response. Doug Ford shrugged his shoulders and said the ship has already left the dock, and Justin Trudeau promised support for workers, but took little action to keep people working. Unifor, the workers' union, expressed outrage and vowed to keep the plant open. The union launched an expansive media campaign, which included TV and newspaper ads that shamed GM for leaving Canada after taking billions in a taxpayer bailout. There were lawn signs, T-shirts, and banner actions. GM Oshawa, which employed over 17,000 hourly workers at its height, had less than 2,500 hourly workers when it announced the closure. GM's withdrawal from Oshawa was painful, particularly in light of the brutal attacks on workers' wages and working conditions, as the corporation had demanded concessions for continuing product and employment. In May 2019, the union agreed to call off its campaign in exchange for GM maintaining aftermarket parts production that secured 300 jobs. Unifor noted that this agreement would also keep the plant viable for future production. Then, in 2020, just a year after GM successfully shed the previously well-established workforce and upended the lives of thousands more through the supply chain, they announced new truck production at the Oshawa facility. While jobs coming to the community was significant and was desperately needed, the return of truck production by GM was also problematic. It leaves the power to make future decisions impacting the community in the hands of a corporation only driven by profit, and it doesn't address the fact that there can be no long-term future for gas-powered pickup trucks in the time of climate crisis. There was another strategy with long-term benefits that should have been pursued by the government and Unifor. Conversion of the plant under public ownership for socially beneficial manufacturing and a transition to a sustainable future. Green Jobs Oshawa took up that call, and our message resonated with many. The foundation of this vision is that there's a climate crisis which demands decisive and bold collective action on a scale that requires government intervention. Individuals cannot do this alone. We must recognize that decisions based on corporate profits are not in the best interests of workers, communities, or society. We believe that manufacturing capacity must be protected and is essential to the sustainability of our future so that we are able to respond quickly and effectively to challenges. However, that manufacturing should not be done for profit, which is why we promoted a publicly owned Crown corporation. To bring this vision to life, we commissioned a preliminary feasibility study based on a triple bottom line. Economic, social, and environmental benefits were all considered to make the case that battery electric fleet vehicles anchored in government procurement and publicly owned could be a viable model. This is just one example of what could be done with a nationalized facility. We also launched a website, did media interviews, created a Facebook page, spoke at events, passed resolutions, and raised awareness that another way was possible. Our message was covered by mainstream television and daily newspapers. We were asked to speak at the global climate strike in Toronto and participated in events on public ownership and just transitions. There was even international interest. And then the COVID-19 crisis came, and the foundations of our call for government intervention at the GM Oshawa facility became even more relevant as Canadians quickly became aware of how unprepared we were for the pandemic. Global supply chains vanished, and lives were put at risk and lost due to inadequate social planning and manufacturing strategies. It is dangerous, as the pandemic has demonstrated, to not be self-reliant for the necessities that meet the basic health and safety needs of our population. So Green Jobs Oshawa called for production of essential medical equipment and supplies at the Oshawa complex. There were examples of auto parts suppliers pivoting production in a matter of days and weeks across the world, including plants in Warren, Michigan, and Indiana, where GM quickly started production of ventilators and masks when faced with the threat of government orders. We were excited when it was announced that GM would be producing 10 million masks at its Oshawa plant under a government contract for cost, not profit. Although we felt this was not nearly enough, this contract and conversion were very significant. It was a modern illustration that it is possible to quickly convert manufacturing capacity to address social need instead of profit when there is political will. Green Jobs Oshawa joined the Canadian Federation of Nurses Unions, the Ontario Council of Hospital Unions to issue a joint statement calling on the government. We wanted them to mandate the production of N95 respirators at the GM Oshawa plant, just as GM had been doing at their plant in Michigan. The statement noted, "It remains remarkable that during this health crisis that there have only been incentives, but no direct pressure on companies to convert their facilities to address this social emergency. What has been needed in this emergency was not subsidies and incentives, but decisive government action, comprehensive planning, and the use of emergency powers to mandate the conversion of manufacturing plants to prioritize public needs." Of course, this is the same scale of action that is needed to address the climate crisis before us. And where are we now? The GM announcement that truck production would be returning to Oshawa has caused the Green Jobs Oshawa campaign to be set aside for the moment. While we were not successful in bringing the plant under public ownership or converting it to electric vehicle production, we have been part of an important conversation around the role of workers in addressing the climate challenge ahead of us. Green Jobs Oshawa is certainly not the first group to respond to plant closure with bold plans. The Lucas Plan is a truly remarkable project that was set in motion in 1974 when Lucas Aerospace announced the need to restructure the company, which would include job loss. A worker organization known as the Combine first sought support from the government to nationalize, but then accepted the suggestion to create an alternative corporate plan for socially beneficial production across the company. The following information is from the story of the Lucas Plan. Around half of Lucas Aerospace output supplied military contracts. Since this depended upon public funding, as did many of the civilian contracts, the Combine argued that state support would be better put to developing products that society needed rather than the state supporting workers through paying redundancy money when they were put out of work. 150 different product ideas were put forward by the workforce. Proposals included an expansion of 40% in the production of kidney dialysis machines, which at the time were being manufactured at one of the Lucas sites. The Combine regarded it as scandalous that people could be dying for the want of a kidney machine when those who could be producing them are facing the prospect of redundancy. Other proposals included the development of heat pumps, solar cell technology, wind turbines, and fuel cell technology. I think it's pretty interesting that this was back in 1976, 1974, because these are things that we certainly could be using now. The proposals were rejected out of hand by Lucas management, indicating they would not diversify from aerospace work, even though they had clearly indicated that aerospace work was in decline, and there was some manufacturing of industrial and medical equipment already being carried out on some of their sites. And this sounds very familiar to me. While individual trade unions and the labor government supported the Combine's plan in principle, there was neither the structure in place nor the political will to put pressure on Lucas Aerospace management to negotiate with the Combine to implement the plan. An opportunity was lost to make a company receiving public money accountable to the community in which it served. 40 years, the products put forward by the Combine and their workers' plan are now mainstream. Meanwhile, the Lucas Aerospace, as a company in its own right, no longer exists. I found the Lucas plan to be brilliant, and I find that it confronts you with big questions, like who decides what will be built, how it should be built, and where it should be built. This incredible struggle is still relevant and inspiring decades later. If you're interested in learning more about the Lucas Plan, there's a wealth of information online, and a good starting point would be the lucasplan.org.uk. Another interesting struggle was Argentina, which became a hotspot of worker action during the financial crisis of the early 2000s. With many businesses going bankrupt and unemployment rising as high as 20%, a movement of workers taking control of shuttered factories sprang up. Their motto was occupy, resist, produce. They went to work, fought in court, and in some cases were able to successfully get converted to cooperatives. Another interesting example is the worker response to the closures of the GN driveline factory in Florence. I have to admit, I'm not well informed about this struggle, but it is still going strong after 3 years. This is a brief description from an article by Lorenzo Feltrin and Emanuele Leonardi, published March 28, 2024. On July 9, 2021, Melrose Industries announced the closure of its GKN driveline, which is an ex-Fiat factory of car axles in Florence, and the layoff of its workers, more than 400. While in many such cases, the workers and unions settle for negotiating enhanced redundancy benefits, the GKN Factory Collective occupied the plants and kickstarted a long struggle against decommissioning. However, what makes the GKN Florence dispute really unique is the strategy adopted by the workers, who sealed an alliance with the climate justice movement by drafting a conversion plan for sustainable public transport and demanding its adoption. Such strategy engendered a cycle of broad mobilizations, repeatedly bringing tens of thousands to the street, so that the dispute is still open and the factory remains under occupation as of today. That was one of the things that made Green Jobs Oshawa very, very powerful as well, was community coalitions. And there is one very exciting and ongoing campaign in Canada from the Canadian Union of Postal Workers. It's called Delivering Community Power and is an excellent example of a union taking a proactive approach. They are reimagining Canada Post with services to support every community. They have proposed such innovative ideas as postal banking, elder check-ins, becoming part of a nationwide EV charging network. One thing that I didn't know is that there are more postal locations than there are Tim Hortons in Canada. They suggest their post offices could become hubs of the green new economy. They are calling for the electrification of their fleet vehicles, retrofitting Canada Post buildings with solar panels, and expanding the use of Canada Post as a consolidated last mile delivery to ease congestion and pollution caused by too many delivery trucks that aren't full to capacity. This is an excellent example of a proactive approach from the union. Please check out their campaign at deliveringcommunitypower.ca. And I'd like to say that I'm sure that everyone here does, but please support postal workers as they continue their fight for fairness and dignity against their employer in their strike right now. These are examples of how dynamic the fight for manufacturing just transition can be. Some were not successful and others to varying degrees, but by fighting back, these workers have created space for others to also fight and think bigger. I'd like to just briefly note the Green Jobs Oshawa preferred public ownership rather than a cooperative model, and we recognize the importance of transforming our transportation systems so that there is major investment in public transportation, not simply trading gas vehicles for battery electric. This conversation is about much more than just manufacturing. This is about every community in Canada, and we need to consider not only manufacturing, but the energy sector, protecting food production, housing, and providing that the basic needs of all Canadians are met. So not only do we survive, but we thrive. Canada should be a leader in sustainable living. The question of conversion and public ownership must be a key part of the strategic discussion of implementing a just transition. A just transition encompasses environmental, social, planning, and the funding are essential for successful conversion strategies. Unions have a critical role to play in educating their members about the challenges, mobilizing and harnessing the strength of their members to drive positive change and to really think big about transformative change. We need our government to abandon the notion that profitable corporations mean secure communities. They don't. Wealthy corporations do not mean healthy communities. Our world is changing quickly. We need to expand the role of public service and quit relying on a piecemeal network that is based on making the rich richer. Corporations continue to show complete disregard for environmental and social devastation caused in the pursuit of their profits, and they won't stop if we don't make them. If workers and communities don't fight to be part of the conversation, they're going to be left out. In closing, I recently listened to a webinar with Elizabeth May, and she made a comment along the lines of, we must have a just transition or we will be faced with unjust disruptions. And I couldn't agree more. The evidence that the environmental crisis threatens the planet is irrefutable and demands immediate, decisive collective action. The climate crisis is going to change everything about how we work, live, and play, whether we are ready for it or not. And I would rather be ready. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. That was excellent. And our last speaker of today is John Clarke.
Thanks, Carlo. So I think that there's a great deal to agree with the propositions that Seth has set forward. And I think it's enormously important that Rebecca offers us a model of how working class people can organize and place demands and advance in this situation. Clearly, I think we all agree that the crisis that we face with regards to climate is at the level of a threat to survival. And there's absolutely no doubt, therefore, that to speak in terms of, or to make comparisons to a war footing is, I think, is a compelling one and an interesting one and an important one, and by no means an invalid one. But I do want to put forward some qualifying considerations that I think are significant and important. We do live in a society in which there are divided class interests. And in that situation, there is a class struggle that unfolds and is ongoing. And I think we need to include that very much in our thinking and in our considerations as we discuss these questions. World War II unquestionably saw an incredible effort of will on the part of the ruling establishment. There's no doubt that that's true. But at that time, the strategic considerations and the need to win the war and the need to triumph in the rivalries of the day were of paramount importance. The comparison to the situation today is not exactly the same by any manner of means. Any rational person would agree that in the face of a climate crisis that confronts us with the population, with the prospect of populations being decimated and civilizational collapse, that taking the measures necessary to avert that situation and to deal with it effectively are of enormous importance. But there is, on the other side, another consideration. And I think it's one that John Bellamy Foster puts forward very, very well in his Capitalism and the Anthropocene. That we do live in a society in which there is a treadmill of production and in which the drive to accumulate is enormously powerful. And that creates a situation where it is possible for the scientific evidence to be overwhelming, but for fossil fuel interests to develop strategies of stalling and greenwashing as they go on emitting carbon, and for governments to unfortunately act in their interests. And so that creates a situation where the class struggle reasserts itself in terms of its importance. There is, of course, an enormous need to transition away from destructive forms of production and energy sources. But as we agree, the term just transition is the absolutely vital one. And that doesn't come automatically. I see in the UK the question raised of North Sea oil workers. The work that they are doing needs to be phased out and phased out very rapidly. But there is it is absolutely essential that not be a repeat of what happened to the miners, and that applies lividly here in Canada, in whole parts of the country. And so there's an absolute necessity to introduce into this discussion the need to defend working class interests as we move forward, both in terms of pushing for transition, but also to defend working class interests. We don't want a climate war measures act. We must defend our rights. We must defend the right to strike. We must defend against the attack that is taking place on migrants and immigrants at the moment. The solutions that were advanced and the measures that were taken during the Second World War period included the internment of Japanese Canadians, and that casts a shadow over the situation today. So there must be a level of independence, of working class independence, that's involved in these struggles. When it comes to the impacts that we are dealing with from climate change, we've just seen the horror that unfolded in Valencia, in the floods that arose there. The need to actually ensure that measures of protection, adaptation, response are there won't, in my opinion, simply be won by putting forward a good plan to governments. It's going to require working class movements actually struggling for these things. We need to ensure that the cooling centres, the emergency responses, the strengthened healthcare systems, the strengthened transportation systems, and all the things that we're going to need in this situation are there. And we can't by any means assume that they're going to be provided by the kind of governments that we have today. There will be one, I would suggest, in struggle. So that's the vital consideration that what I believe to be a vital consideration that I wanted to make my contribution to the discussion today. We are facing a dire crisis, but there is an acute need for us to, I think, accept that the notion of all working together for the common good, the notion that we're all in this together, doesn't actually go very far. There is a need for distinct, clear, independent working class action to be part of this situation. And I would finally say, when it comes to the role of the state, that absolutely we need to be pushing for measures to be taken by the state. We need to place our demands before the state. It is absolutely true that at the moment, this existential crisis is being responded to as a down the list of issues to deal with kind of an item, and not being responded to as it needs to be. So we need to actually win measures of transition, and we need to win measures of protection in the face of dire climate impacts that are unfolding, and that's absolutely essential. But I also think, in terms of the orientation of our movement on this question, I think there's a reason why they're gathering in Baku at the moment and bringing together fossil fuel lobbyists and engaging in evasion and deception. I think that fundamentally, while we must fight in the here and now and win what we can, I do think that an eco-socialist perspective is a very, very important one. I think we do live under an economic and social system that has shown itself to be unwilling and incapable to build a sustainable relationship with the natural world. So yes, there needs to be a war, but frankly, I think the class war has to be a very, very big part of that. Thank you.